Chapter 16. What happened to the two travelers with two girls, two monkeys, and the savages known as the Orellans. Candide and his valet had passed the border guards before anyone in the camp knew of the German Jesuit's death. The vigilant Cacambo had been careful to fill his saddlebag with bread, chocolate, ham, fruit, and a few bottles of wine. On their Andalusian horses they plunged into unknown country, where they found no road. Finally they came to a beautiful meadow intersected by streams. Our two travelers let their horses graze. Cacambo suggested to his master that they should eat, and he set him an example. "How do you expect me to eat ham," said Candide, "when I've just killed the Baron's son, and find myself doomed never to see the fair Cunegonde again for the rest of my life? What's the use of prolonging my miserable days, since I must drag them out far away from her in remorse and despair? And what will the Journal de Trevoux say?" As he spoke thus, he continued to eat. The sun was setting. The two lost travelers heard little cries which seemed to come from women. They did not know whether they were cries of pain or of joy, but they leapt to their feet with the anxiety and alarm which everything arouses in an unknown country. The cries came from two naked girls who were running nimbly along the edge of the meadow, while two monkeys followed them, biting their buttocks. Candide was moved to pity. He had learned to shoot in the Bulgar army, and he could have shot a hazelnut from a tree without touching the leaves. He picked up his double-barreled Spanish rifle and fired, killing the two monkeys. "God be praised, my dear Cacambo, I've delivered those two poor creatures from a great danger. If I sinned in killing an inquisitor and a Jesuit, I've atoned for it by saving the lives of two girls. They may be young ladies of noble birth, and the incident may bring us great advantages in this country." He was about to go on, but his tongue suddenly became paralyzed when he saw the girls lovingly embrace the monkeys, burst into tears over their bodies, and fill the air with grief-stricken cries. "I wasn't expecting such tender compassion," he said at length to Cacambo. "That was a fine thing to do, sir," said Cacambo. "You've killed those young ladies' lovers." "Their lovers? Impossible! You're joking, Cacambo. How could I believe such a thing?" "My dear master," replied Cacambo, "you're always surprised by everything. Why do you find it so strange that in some countries there should be monkeys that enjoy the favors of ladies? They're a quarter human, just as I'm a quarter Spanish." "Alas," said Candide, "I do remember hearing Dr. Pangloss say that similar incidents had happened in the past, that such mixtures had produced Egyptians, Aegyptians, fauns, and satyrs, and that several great men of antiquity had seen them. But I regarded all that as fables. Now you should be convinced that it's true," said Cacambo. You can see how people behave when they've been given a different upbringing. All I'm afraid of is that those ladies may make trouble for us." These well-founded reflections determined Candide to leave the meadow and go into the forest. He and Cacambo ate supper there, and before cursing the Inquisitor of Portugal, the Governor of Buenos Aires, and the Baron, they both went to sleep on the moss. When they awoke, they found that they could not move. The reason for this was that during the night the Orellans, the inhabitants of the country, to whom the ladies had denounced them, had tied them up with ropes made of bark. They were surrounded by about 50 naked Orellans, armed with arrows, clubs, and stone axes. Some of them were heating a large cauldron of water, others were preparing spits, and all were shouting, "He's a Jesuit! He's a Jesuit! We'll have our revenge and eat a good meal! Let's eat Jesuit! Let's eat Jesuit!" "I was right, dear master," cried Cacambo sadly, "when I told you those two girls would make trouble for us." Seeing the cauldron and the spits, Candide cried out, "We're surely going to be either roasted or boiled. Ah, what would Dr. Pangloss say if he saw what pure nature is like? All is well, I won't argue about it, but I must admit it's a cruel fate to have lost Lady Cunegonde and then be roasted on a spit by the Orellans." Cacambo never lost his head. "Don't give up hope," he said to the forlorn Candide. "I know a little of these people's jargon, and I'm going to speak to them. Be sure to point out to them how horribly inhuman it is to cook men, said Candide, and how unchristian it is too. Gentlemen, said Cacambo, you expect to eat a Jesuit today. That's perfectly all right. Nothing could be more just than to treat your enemies that way, for natural law teaches us to kill our neighbor, and that's how people behave all over the world. If we don't exercise the right to eat him, it's because we have other things to make a good meal of. But you don't have the same resources as we do, and it's certainly better to eat your enemies than abandon the fruit of your victory to crows and ravens. However, gentlemen, you wouldn't want to eat your friends. You think you're about to put a Jesuit on the spit, but you're actually about to roast your defender, the enemy of your enemies. I myself was born in your country, and this gentleman is my master. Far from being a Jesuit, he just killed a Jesuit and is wearing his clothes. That's the cause of your mistake. To verify what I'm saying, take his robe, bring it to the nearest border post of the Father's kingdom, and find out whether or not my master has killed a Jesuit officer. It won't take long, and you can still eat us if you find out I've lied to you. But if I've told the truth, you're too well acquainted with the principles of international law, morality, and justice not to spare our lives. The Orellans found this speech quite reasonable. They appointed 2 notables to inquire into the truth of the matter. The 2 delegates carried out their mission intelligently and soon returned with good news. The Orellans untied their prisoners, treated them with great courtesy, offered them women, gave them refreshments, and led them to the border of their territory, shouting joyfully, "He's not a Jesuit! He's not a Jesuit!" Candide was filled with wonder at the cause of his deliverance. What a people, he kept exclaiming. What men! What morality! If I hadn't been lucky enough to thrust my sword through the body of Lady Cunegonde's brother, I'd surely have been eaten. But pure nature is good after all, since instead of eating me, these people showered me with polite kindness, and as soon as they found out, I wasn't a Jesuit. Chapter 17. How Candide and his valet came to the land of Eldorado. When they reached the border of the Orellans' territory, Cacambo said to Candide, "You see, this hemisphere is no better than the other one. Believe me, the best thing we can do is go back to Europe by the shortest route possible." "How can we?" said Candide, "and where could I go? If I go back to my country, I'll find the Bulgars and the Avars, slaughtering everyone in sight, and if I return to Portugal, I'll be burned. If we stay here, we're in constant danger of being put on a spit. But how can I bring myself to leave the part of the world Lady Cunegonde is living in?" "Let's head for Cayenne," said Cacambo. "We'll find some Frenchmen there who travel all over the world, and they'll be able to help us. Perhaps God will take pity on us." It was not easy to get to Cayenne. They knew approximately what direction to take, but there were terrible obstacles everywhere. Mountains, rivers, precipices, bandits and savages. Their horses died of fatigue, and they used all their provisions. After eating nothing but wild fruits for a whole month, they came at last to a stream whose banks were lined with coconut trees, which sustained their lives and their hopes. Cacambo, whose advice was always as good as the old woman's, said to Candide, "We can't go on like this. We've walked enough. I see an empty boat on the bank. Let's fill it with coconuts, get into it, and drift with the current. A river always leads to some inhabited spot. If we don't find anything pleasant, we'll at least find something new." "Let's go," said Candide. "We'll place ourselves in the hands of Providence." They drifted for several miles between banks that were sometimes covered with flowers, sometimes arid, sometimes flat, and sometimes steep. The river grew steadily wider until at last it vanished into a vault of awe-inspiring rocks that rose up to the sky. The 2 travelers had the courage to abandon themselves to the stream as it flowed under this vault. The river narrowed at this spot and bore them along with terrible speed and noise. After 24 hours, they saw daylight again, but their boat was smashed against a reef. They had to crawl from rock to rock for nearly 3 miles, until finally they saw a vast horizon bordered by unscalable mountains. The land here was cultivated for pleasure as well as from necessity. Everywhere everywhere the useful had been made pleasant. The roads were covered, or rather adorned, with beautifully formed carriages made of lustrous material, carrying men and women of extraordinary beauty, and swiftly drawn by large red sheep, whose speed surpassed that of the finest horses of Andalusia, Tetuan, or Meknes. Here's a better country than Westphalia, said Candide. He and Cacambo entered the first village they came to. Several children, wearing tattered gold brocade, were playing quoits at the edge of this village. Quoits at the edge of this village. Our two men from the other world stopped to watch them. Their quoits were rather large, round objects, yellow, red, or green, which shone with extraordinary brilliance. Our travelers picked up a few of them, and found that some were made of gold, while others were emeralds or rubies. The smallest one of them would have been the greatest ornament of a Mogul's throne. These children playing quoits, said Cacambo, must be the sons of the king of this country. Just then the village schoolmaster came out to call the children back to school. There's the tutor of the royal family, said Candide. The little urchins immediately stopped playing, leaving their quoits and other playthings on the ground. Candide picked them up, ran to the tutor, and humbly presented them to him, making signs to point out to him that their royal highnesses had forgotten their gold and jewels. The village schoolmaster smiled, dropped them on the ground, looked at Candide for a moment in great surprise, then turned and went on his way. The travelers did not fail to pick up the gold, rubies, and emeralds. Where are we? Cried Candide. The children of the kings of this country must be well brought up, since they are taught to despise gold and jewels. Cacambo was as surprised as Candide. Finally they came to the first house of the village. It was built like a European palace. Large numbers of people were crowding around the door, and there were even more inside. They could hear delightful music and smell a delicious odor of cooking. Cacambo walked up to the door and heard that the people were speaking Peruvian, his native tongue, for, as everyone knows, Cacambo was born in Tucumán, in a village where that was the only language known. I'll be your interpreter, he said to Candide. Let's go inside. This is an inn. Two waiters and two waitresses, dressed in gold cloth, with their hair tied in ribbons, immediately invited them to sit down to table. They were served 4 tureens of soup, each garnished with 2 parrots, a boiled condor weighing 200 pounds, 2 roasted monkeys of excellent flavor, 300 colibri in one dish, and 600 hummingbirds in another. There were also exquisite stews and delicious pastries, and everything was served in dishes made of a kind of rock crystal. The waiters and waitresses poured out various liquors made from sugarcane. The other guests were mostly merchants and carters, all extremely polite. They asked Cacambo a few questions with the most delicate discretion, and gave satisfactory answers to the questions he asked them. When the meal was over, Cacambo and Candide thought they had amply paid their bill when they left on the table 2 big pieces of gold they had two of the big pieces of gold they had picked up. But the host and hostess burst out laughing and held their sides for a long time. Gentlemen, said the host, it's easy to see you're not from our country, and we're not used to foreigners. Excuse us for laughing when you offered to pay us with 2 stones from our roads. You probably have none of our money, but you don't need any to dine here. All inns run for the convenience of people engaged in commerce are paid for by the government. You've fared badly here because this is a poor village, but everywhere else you'll be given the reception you deserve. Cacambo explained the host's remarks to Candide, who listened to them with the same wonder and bewilderment his friend felt as he translated them. What country can this be? Said one to the other, unknown to the rest of the world, and so different in every way from anything we've ever seen before. It's probably the country where everything goes well, because there must be one like that somewhere, and despite what Dr. Pangloss used to say, I often noticed that everything went rather badly in Westphalia. Chapter 18. What they saw in the land of Eldorado. Cacambo expressed his extreme curiosity to the host, who said to him, I'm very ignorant and quite happy to stay that way, but we have here an old man who's retired from the court. He is the most learned man in the kingdom, and the most communicative. He immediately took Cacambo to the old man's house. Candide, relegated to a secondary role, accompanied his valet. The house they entered was a very simple one, for its door was made only of silver, and the rooms were panelled only with gold, although the workmanship was in such good taste that the richest panelling was not superior. The antechamber was encrusted only with rubies and emeralds. It is true, but the order in which everything was arranged made up for this extreme simplicity. The old man received the two strangers sitting on a sofa stuffed with colibri feathers, and had them served liqueurs in diamond goblets. He then satisfied their curiosity as follows. I'm 172 years old, and my father, the king's equerry, told me about the amazing Peruvian Revolutions he witnessed. This kingdom is the former land of the Incas, who rashly left it to go off and subjugate another part of the world, and who were finally destroyed by the Spaniards. The princes of their royal family who remained in their native land showed greater wisdom with the consent of the nation. They ordained, that no inhabitant of our little kingdom should ever leave it, and that's what has preserved our innocence and our happiness. The Spaniards had a confused knowledge of this country, which they called Eldorado, and an Englishman named Raleigh came quite close to it about 100 years ago. But since we're surrounded by unscalable mountains and cliffs, so far we've been safe from the rapacity of European nations, who have an incredible lust for the pebbles and dirt of our land, and would kill every one of us to get to them. The conversation was long. It touched on the form of government, customs and morals, women, public spectacles, and the arts. Finally, Candide, who was always interested in metaphysics, told Cacambo to ask whether the country had a religion. The old man blushed slightly. What? He exclaimed. Can you doubt that we have a religion? Do you think we're ingrates? Cacambo humbly asked him what the religion of Eldorado was. The old man blushed again and said, Can there be two religions? We have, I believe, the same religion as everyone else. We worship God morning and night. Do you worship only one God? Asked Cacambo, still serving as the interpreter of Candide's doubts. Of course, said the old man. There aren't two gods, or three, or four. I must say that people from your world ask very strange questions. Candide continued to press the kindly old man with questions. He wanted to know how people prayed in Eldorado. We don't pray, said the venerable sage. We have nothing to ask of God. He is giving us everything we need. We constantly thank him. Candide was curious to see some of their priests. He asked where they were. The kindly old man smiled and said, My friends, we're all priests. The king and all heads of families solemnly sing hymns of thanksgiving every morning, accompanied by an orchestra of 5,000 or 6,000 musicians. What? You have no monks to teach, argue, rule, plot, and burn people who don't agree with them? We'd be mad if we did, said the old man. We all agree with each other here, and we don't know what you mean when you talk about your monks. Candide was enraptured as he listened to all this, and he said to himself, This is quite different from Westphalia and the Baron's castle. If our friend Pangloss had seen Eldorado, he wouldn't have said that the castle of Thunder Ten Tronckh was the finest thing on earth. It's obvious that everyone ought to travel. After this long conversation, the kindly old man had 6 sheep harnessed to a carriage and assigned 12 of his servants to take the 2 travelers to court. Forgive me, he said to them, for not accompanying you. My age deprives me of that honor. The king will give you a reception with which you won't be dissatisfied, and I'm sure you'll excuse the customs of our country if some of them displease you. Candide and Cacambo got into the carriage. The 6 sheep set off at great speed, and in less than 4 hours they reached the king's palace, which stood at one end of the capital. Its portal was 200 feet high and 100 feet wide. It would be impossible to describe the material of it. The material it was made of. but it is easy to understand how enormously superior it must have been to the pebbles and sand we call precious stones and gold. When Candide and Cacambo alighted from the carriage, they were received by 20 beautiful girls attached to the palace. They took the visitors to the baths, and dressed them in robes made of hummingbird down. The great lords and ladies of the court then led them to his Majesty's apartments, passing between two ranks of 1,000 musicians each, according to custom. As they were approaching the throne room, Cacambo asked a great lord how they should behave when they were brought into his Majesty's presence, whether they should fall to their knees or flat on their faces, whether they should put their hands on their heads or on their behinds, whether they should lick the dust on the floor, in short, what the proper procedure was. The custom, said the lord, is to embrace the king and kiss him on both cheeks. Candide and Cacambo threw their arms around his Majesty's neck. He gave them an extremely gracious welcome and courteously invited them to supper. In the meantime, they were shown around the city. They saw public buildings that rose up to the clouds, marketplaces adorned with countless columns, fountains of clear water, pink water, or sugar-cane liqueurs, which flowed continuously in broad public squares paved with a kind of precious stone that gave off an odor like that of cloves and cinnamon. Candide asked to see the law courts. He was told that there were none, that lawsuits were unknown. He asked if there were prisons. The answer was no. What surprised and delighted him most of all was the Palace of Science, where he saw a gallery 2,000 paces long, filled with instruments of mathematics and physics. After they had spent the whole afternoon covering about 1,000th of the city, they were taken back to the royal palace. Candide sat down to table with his Majesty, his valet Cacambo, and several ladies. No better meal was ever served, and no supper conversation was ever more sparkling than his Majesty's. Cacambo explained his witty remarks to Candide, and they seemed witty even in translation. Of all the things that amazed Candide, this was by no means the least amazing. They spent a month in the palace. Candide kept saying to Cacambo, once again, my friend, I admit there's no comparison between this country and the castle where I was born, but it's still true that Lady Cunegonde isn't here, and you must have some mistress in Europe too. If we stay here, we'll only be like everyone else, but if we go back to our world with no more than 12 sheep laden with stones from Eldorado, we'll be richer than all the kings of Europe put together. We'll have no more inquisitors to fear, and we can easily rescue Lady Cunegonde. Cacambo was pleased to hear this. A man who has traveled always enjoys coming home to show off and tell impressive stories about the things he has seen abroad. So the two fortunate men decided to be fortunate no longer. They asked his Majesty for permission to leave. It's a foolish thing to do, said the king. I know my country doesn't amount to much, but when a man is fairly well off somewhere, he ought to stay there. I certainly have no right to prevent foreigners from leaving. That kind of tyranny is sanctioned by neither our customs nor our laws. All men are free. You may leave whenever you like, but you'll have a very difficult journey. It's impossible to sail against the current of the river that miraculously brought you here, and which flows through vaults of rock. The mountains surrounding my kingdom are 10,000 feet high, and as steep as a wall. They're all over 25 miles wide, and they drop straight down on the other side. However, since you're determined to leave, I'll order my mechanical engineers to construct a machine that will carry you in comfort. When you've been taken over the mountains, no one can go with you any further, because my subjects have all sworn never to go beyond them, and they're too wise to break their word. But you may ask me for anything else you wish. All we ask, your Majesty, said Cacambo, is a few sheep laden with food and some of the pebbles and mud of your country. The king laughed and said, I can't understand why you people from Europe are so fond of our yellow mud, but take as much as you like, and you're welcome to it. He immediately ordered his engineers to make a machine to hoist the two extraordinary men out of the kingdom. 3,000 learned scientists worked on it. It was finished in 2 weeks and cost no more than 20,000 pounds sterling in the currency of the country. Candide and Cacambo were placed on the machine. There were 2 large red sheep saddled and bridled for them to ride after they had crossed the mountains, 20 pack sheep laden with food, 30 bearing gifts consisting of some of the country's most remarkable products, and 50 laden with gold, diamonds, and other precious stones. The king affectionately embraced the 2 wanderers. Their departure was a wonderful sight, and so was the ingenious way in which they and their sheep were lifted over the mountains. The scientists took leave of them after placing them in safety. Candide had no other desire and aim than to go and present his sheep to Lady Cunegonde. "We now have enough to pay the governor of Buenos Aires," he said. "If Lady Cunegonde's freedom can be bought, let's go to Cayenne and set sail from there. Then we'll see what kingdom we can buy."